Okay, so we're recording. Um, Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I live in Boulder, Colorado.
Nice.
Um,
My best friend lives in Boulder.
is that right?
Yeah, just outside of.
Okay. Well, I've only been here for 3 years. I'm actually a native of Kansas City,
Oh, great.
and yeah, moved here 3 years ago, and really like it. Like where I'm living, and it's very dog friendly. Which I have a golden doodle, and she just has a great time here. So yeah,
Awesome. How long have you been writing?
I've been writing, gosh, on and off for my whole life, but it seems like I've always, it's my go-to if I'm anxious, it's my go-to if I'm depressed, it's my go-to for a lot of things. And I used to write like song lyrics too, just for myself,
Yeah.
poetry and song lyrics, and which I really enjoy doing as well. But this is the first attempt I've made at a book, and I'm loving the process. It's very difficult, but I've never really sat down to just put together something that makes sense from a beginning to an end like this. And I've had to, I've taken a lot of like online courses and read a lot of books on how to, the craft of writing,
Yeah.
because I didn't know anything about it. And the more I learned, the more I realized that I didn't know.
Yeah.
But it's coming
I,
around.
I still feel that way.
Oh my gosh.
I still feel like, oh, look at that thing that I didn't know anything about.
Oh, for
Um,
sure.
yeah. So talk to me about, so this is your first book you've tried to write. How long have you been working on it?
Well, I started writing on it several years ago.
Okay.
Um, and I always kind of had in the back of my mind that I'd like to write a book about my topic, which is uh, basically men with eating disorders,
Okay.
because so little is, and I've always felt this way. I've had an eating disorder for a long time, and there's not a lot written about men dealing with this issue that, by and large, the media and the literature and things, it's all geared around women, which I understand because they do have a greater occurrence of eating disorders, but still men constitute maybe 20% of eating disorders. I mean, it's a sizable amount.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've just wanted to be able to relate to men and say, hey, you don't need to hide behind a stigma or be embarrassed about talking about it. That the sooner you get treatment and help, the better off you're going to be. And so I've always kind of had in the back of my mind that I wanted to at least reach out to men, make a connection.
I love that. It's weird, this is just a side note, but it's weird how we associate certain, health things to certain genders. It's just a strange thing, like
Yes.
eating disorders tend to be like shot toward women, depression and like PTSD tends to be shot toward men, where like gender actually
Yes.
has nothing to do with it. Yeah, so
Right.
I love the concept that you're working on. I think it's great.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Um, talked how far, so I'm asking these questions, Scott, to kind of get a feeling for
Yeah.
what kind of notes, when we talk through the notes, what kind of feedback to give you so that it's best helpful to help you finish the book. So how much have you written?
I've written, I would say it's about 3/4 full. I've finished.
Okay. So
Um,
like 30,000 words, 20,000
More than
words.
30,000, more like it's approaching 45, 50,000.
Okay. Where does the chapter you sent me fall in that 50,000 words?
Towards the end of what I've sent you, or yeah, it falls a little bit later
Okay.
um, than I'd say.
Second half, at least.
Yeah, second
Okay.
half. Yeah.
Great. Um, Sorry, I was trying to think of how to phrase the question. What kind of writing are you doing? Do you have the whole thing plotted out and you're like writing scene to scene, or are you more pantsing it, meaning like more journal style? Like today I'm going to sit down and write and this is what comes out of me.
I, I've been more of a, I don't have a formal outline, but
Okay.
I've been more of a pantster than
Okay.
just going from the seat of my pants. Or is it? No, I get the two words mixed up.
Yeah. So plotter
Oh,
tends to
plotter.
be like have like a spreadsheet and you're like, okay, I got my list of scenes. I'm going to write them out one at a time. The other extreme is a pantser, which is like I'm just going to sit down and write what comes out. I have a general idea, but I'm just going to write it. The truth is that no one's actually 100% either. Like
Right.
we're all it's a spectrum and we're all kind of on the spectrum somewhere. The reason I ask is because, and it sounds like from what you just said that you've got an idea of what you're going to write, but you kind of lean towards, I'm going to sit down and write toward this concept.
True, but I do have. I've tried to. Now I've been adding things as I've gone along, but I have started uh, with the scenes,
Okay.
and making the scenes into chapters.
And this is nonfiction.
Yes, it's a
Okay.
memoir.
Gotcha. And when you start thinking about like the scenes and the chapters you're going to write, are you thinking about stories you want to tell or points you want to make?
Good question. And both. I
Okay.
mean, because the point I want to make has to be told in a story.
100%.
And so I'm very conscious as I write this to relate my eating disorder to the stories.
Okay.
I don't want to just tell a story because it's what I think is a good story, without it really dovetailing into what my concept is, my mission statement, which is, writing about the eating disorder and my how it developed. And there's a lot of and this I think will appeal to men. There's a lot in it about exercise and exercise bulimia, it's called, which is common amongst men.
Gotcha. So we've got the memoir you're telling, and you've got
Right.
some scenes and some points you want to make about scenes. Are you telling it in chronological order, or are you telling it in theme order?
I am telling it in chronological order.
Okay, great.
And I had a difficult time with that, the structure of it, because as I was writing, I would want to go back, but I don't want to do too much in backstory.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But anyway, the way it's worked out and the way I feel comfortable now is it's mostly chronological.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I'm going to share my screen and let's look at the scene itself.
Great.
And excuse me, I'm going to cough real quick. Sorry, I didn't want to do that in the mic. Okay, so
All right.
can you see this scene on your screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm just going to go through an overview real quick of what I saw, and then we can get into individual things. Let me blow it up so we can actually look at it.
Great.
Yeah, sorry. It's always one of those there we go.
Perfect.
So we start off with this conversation about you moving to the beach and finding a gym.
Right.
And then you have a kind of aside here about some words that were really meaningful to you.
Yes.
And then we come into here with this moment of talking about your eating disorder, and kind of you give us like an overview of the journey that you were on here.
Right.
And then once we get through the overview of the journey, we then come into this scene, which was really well written. by the way,
Thank you.
between you and Beth, which
Yeah,
is an argument about cutting up eggplant
right.
and what knife you're using.
Exactly.
So let me ask, of the 60,000 plus words you've got, I don't remember the actual number you told me, you've got written, does most of it resemble the first of this piece or the last of this piece?
Uh, in terms of like adding dialogue versus not dialogue,
In
or
terms of structure. So I would say the
right,
first of this piece is very much what I term a summary, which
right,
is like you're telling me things that happened. And
right,
actually, you kind of have three sections. You have like a summary, and then you have a teaching section where you're like teaching me about a concept of eating disorders. And
right,
then you have a narrative scene where you're jumping into this moment with you and Beth.
right,
So if we think about it as in how the reader is engaged in it,
mhm,
and this is super true for memoir. The the summary scenes at the top where you're giving me broad action of like, then
mhm,
we went here and then this happened and then this happened. That's at that like 40,000 foot level, right? Like,
right,
so let's imagine I'm just going to use the illustration I use I've used before because it's comfortable for me and I won't stumble over it. So imagine you're like your memoir, the story you want to tell is a forest, right? This summary section is like being in a helicopter and looking down on the forest. You're
right,
like, and then you can see this section over there, and then you can see this section over there, and then you can see this section over there. When we get down to the last section where we're actually like living in the scene with you and Beth, that's like being amongst the trees. And it's like being on the ground inside the forest, like being able to touch the trees and smell the air and like be a part of the environment. Does that make
right.
sense? So we've got
Sure.
this like up high piece and this down low piece. In memoir and in nonfiction, we add this kind of third component, which I would call teaching. And teaching kind of like gets us out of the helicopter altogether. So teaching is kind of like, okay, we're gonna put the whole story aside for a second and talk about this concept.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
So academic papers are like 95% teaching,
Okay.
right? And like 5% like summary and 0% scene. Academic books, like if you're like I used to read a ton of leadership books, right? Like for my old job. And I read a ton of craft books now. These are what I would call like academic works.
Mhm.
They're just in that frame of like their goal is to teach me something. They're like 50% teaching, 15% summary, and then the rest of it in the scene. Good ones are, right? So half of it is teaching, and then 20% of it is like trying to get us into a moment where the author's like describing a moment where amongst the trees, and then the last little bit is the like summary, and typically summaries end up being transitions. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Right.
So really great memoirs, right? Like, and I've read 3 this month. So I read, or this over the last 2 months, I read Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. Fantastic
Oh yeah.
memoir.
Yeah.
um I read well, I guess that wasn't a memoir. He writes in shock jock memoir style though. I read Men Who Stare at Goats by John Ronson, which is his like memoir about him discovering things the CIA did in the 1970s. It's supposed to be a nonfiction, but because he writes in shock jock journalism style, where he like throws himself into the middle of the story, it reads like a memoir. And then right now I'm reading Reborn in the USA, and I can't remember the author's name, about immigrating to the United States from Liverpool. The author's name, sorry, I'm looking it up on my Kindle because I want to make sure I get his name.
Is it Bruce Springsteen?
No, it's Roger Bennett.
Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know, right? You'd think so. Yeah, it's Roger Bennett. So those are three excellent memoirs. They are like 80% in the woods, on the ground, in the scene, touching everything, like your last piece with Beth. And then in the middle of those scenes, they give us like a paragraph or two of teaching. And then to transition between scenes, usually at the opening of a chapter or at the closing of a chapter, we'll get like a paragraph or two of summary. The reason the reason memoirs, like really great memoirs, work that way is because the struggle a memoir has is keeping the reader engaged.
Sure.
Because the reader's showing up for your story, right? The reader, yes, they want to learn about eating disorders, but if they really want to learn about eating disorders, they're going to go pick up something that's more an academic work, right? That's going to be like, 15 things about eating disorders, male eating disorders you didn't know, right? Like if that's what or like, men have eating disorders too. And that book is going to be a lot of science, and it's going to be a lot of like social science, like, hey, here's the percentage of men who struggle with eating disorders, that kind of thing. It's going to be less your personal experience, but your personal experience is going to be thrown in at like 20%, right? Because it's that like academic focus. So my question is like, before we get into the actual, like what I would recommend you do with this piece and editing moving forward, where are you leaning? Are you leaning more toward memoir, or are you leaning more toward like academic discussion about male eating disorders?
No, I'm leaning towards the former.
Okay, toward memoir.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, that's super. Is that description helpful before I move
Oh
into the
yeah,
piece
yeah.
itself?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please do.
Other than dialogue, how do you get into the woods?
Nice. Let's talk about that. Perfect segue. Excellent question. So, because dialogue's the easiest way in, but it's not the only way in. So right here in these opening scenes, you're like half there. And I just want a little bit more. With memoir, so with Reborn in the USA is a great example of this. He does a lot of, if this were fiction, and if Reborn in the USA were fiction, and I got it as an editor, I'd be like, oh man, way too many summaries. I got to see this scene. I got to be in the middle of this scene. You're like you're telling me about action. No good. Because it's a memoir, we kind of excuse that more. We expect it because of the genre. We're like, he's going to tell me a lot about what happened because he's talking to me about his life. So I'm just going to hear it about his life. I read another memoir this month. I read, oh crap. See, I've forgotten the name now. I read one about a comedian who really struggled with having a baby. Like they got pregnant and he hated it. I can't remember the name. Man, that's going to kill me that I can't remember that name. People listening to the podcast are probably screaming at me right now. But he did it too, right? Like you get a lot of summary of like, hey, this is how this thing went. Like, this is how this, like I was in this place at this time and this is how I felt. So the entryway to get us really in there is to focus on your feelings in the moment. As if you're telling us at a kitchen table about how it happened. So great memoir, you feel like you're sitting at a kitchen table with the author and he's just telling you the story. So let's look here at your opening scene. Where to live in Seattle, not my ideal place to live, especially compared to the oasis of San Diego. Through a friend, I learned about beach communities in the Los Angeles airport, beach. So you've got a great line here that starts to build. This is just, I'm like, okay, he's building into something. After driving around the congested, car-infested area of Woodland Hills, Encino, Santa Monica, and Mel de Rey, I decided to live by the beach. San Fernando Valley just wouldn't work. This opening right here, after driving around the congested, car-infested areas of Woodland Hills, Encino, Santa Monica, and Woodland Bay, I decided to live by the beach. I need to know what that was like. What was it like to sit in that congestion? How did it feel to sit in that congestion? Right. And I need to know, you need to contrast it for me with the beach. So you come down here and do that down here. The beach had long sidewalks called the Strand that paralleled the ocean. But I need these two paragraphs together so that I can live that experience with you.
Mm-hmm.
With every like piece of summary writing like this in a memoir, you have to help me live the experience. I have to feel and know what's going on. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Again, you've got a good one here. After scouring the paper want ads, I eventually found a one-bedroom bungalow at Avenue A, Rodeo Beach, just 3 blocks from the famous Rodeo Pier. I was soon I was moving in a few things. I had my new digs. Although it wasn't La Jolla, I grew to love the area. So this paragraph is a great like ending to the moving in. But I need the comparison of what you were looking at to the comparison of the beach to then to the like what happened, then the moving in and then joining the gym. And here you say like you have this paragraph on like finding a gym. The distraction of the job and moving left my eating disorder, angry and craving for attention. Finding a gym, settling into a new exercise regime, and finding a place where I felt comfortable eating were high priority items for appeasing my ongoing disease. So this is your scene. Because this is what you're trying to get to, right? Like all of this is preface to you talking about the craving, your eating disorder, angry and craving for attention. Right. So you have to find a gym to like satisfy the eating disorder. So if I were to rebuild this scene entirely, I would want like 90% of the scene is you checking out gyms and you looking at gyms and telling me what you're looking for in a gym. And as you're looking at people, what are you thinking about when you walk through that gym? How much of that is your eating disorder? Right? What does that craving for attention feel like? Right? Like this is a fantastic sentence. The distraction of the job and moving left my eating disorder angry and craving for attention. I need to know what that is. Right? Like if I have an eating disorder, I don't know it. Right? Like I'm just talking like your normal reader. Maybe I work out a ton. Maybe I do like have this craving for a gym, but I haven't recognized it. You got to let me live that moment.
Okay.
So like you got to go deep there. Like that's what I want. I want to know when you're driving here in traffic and you're distracted, how is that connected to this eating disorder, anger, and craving for attention? When you're looking for an apartment, how is that connected to this? And then I want this to be the thing, right? Like I want to know, like when you're driving around, are you thinking about where you're going to go work out? When you're looking for an apartment, are you judging how close it is to a gym, right? Like when you're looking at gyms, what does that mean? Does that make sense? Yeah. How does that feel?
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. So you want to see me in the car, frustrated that the traffic in front of me is a parking lot.
Yeah.
And it's hot and yeah, whatever. But
yeah. So like, instead of like not compared to the Oasis of San Diego. So instead of this like bigger 40,000 foot view where you're telling me the decision, take me to the moment.
Right.
Okay. I was sitting in the car. I was looking around and I couldn't imagine myself living here. Right. It was hot. We were moving at 2 miles an hour. And, and all I could think about is when's the next time I'm going to go work out.
Right.
Right. Like, because it needs to tie into your premise. So So for each, the 3-story method puts it this way, and I use it because I think it's the simplest plot kind of structure that I've read. It says conflict, choice, and consequence, right? What's the conflict you're experiencing? What are the choices in front of you? So the conflict you're experiencing is that you got to move. You're trying to find a place to move. And you're also obsessed with like finding a new gym, but you're distracted by moving, right? That's the conflict that I read in these first 4 paragraphs.
Mm-hmm.
Choices. I can live here, where in San Diego, or I can live in these beach communities. So I need to see you weighing the choices, right? And I need the choices to stay on theme. I need the choices to revolve around your eating disorder. How's your eating disorder impacting these choices? And if they're not, if it doesn't, you probably shouldn't have it in the book.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's the next thing I'm going to talk to you about. But how's your eating disorder impacting these choices? And then what's the consequence of the place that you pick? Right? So you pick this beach place, right? You settle in, and then you immediately begin searching for the next gym you can join. Right? So the consequence is where I live doesn't actually matter. All that matters is dealing with my eating disorder. Right? So like that's what I don't know if that's true. That's what I'm reading here into your paragraphs. So,
Right.
using that structure and getting us into that conflict will naturally devolve into creating a more engaging scene where you feel like you're around the woods, even if you have no dialogue.
Okay.
Okay, let's pause here. What questions do you have about that?
No, I think that's very descriptive, and I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
I just need to move some things, or yeah, I need to expand on it. And okay,
Yeah.
but and yeah, I understand what you're saying.
So now let's go to the fourth, like to the bigger view of the whole manuscript. Right. For 15 years, I worked with churches and I did a lot of preaching, which preaching is this weird thing where it is really giving a weekly memoir or a weekly, you are presenting to a group of people a weekly nonfiction essay. That's what preaching is. I mean, some people would argue whether or not it's fiction. I don't want to talk about that today. But right, like in pure structure, you're giving a memoir / nonfiction essay. So when we structure that, right, the way that I would recommend you go about editing your book, because my bet is you have a lot of scenes like this.
Yeah.
And your language is so good. You're a good writer, right? Like your descriptions are crisp and they're sharp and you're doing good work and you've got great sentences here, like the distraction of the job and moving left my eating disorder, anger, and craving for attention. As you go through this book and start to put it together, what I would do, I would ignore how you currently have it broken down into chapters. And I would take each section like this. So you have this section.
Mm-hmm.
And I would ask, what is it I'm trying to say with this scene?
Mm-hmm.
So my preaching teacher used to say, you can, in a 1-hour sermon, which is like, I kind of equate it to like one chapter of a nonfiction memoir. You can get 3 points across maximum. People are going to remember 3 things. Andy Stanley, who is a real famous preacher that speaks to tens of thousands every week, says you get one thing. You get to get 1 point across per chapter. So what a preacher does and what a good memoir does, right? What Reborn in the USA is doing, what John Ronson does with his chapters, what Greenlights did with Matthew McConaughey. He's starting this like conversation of each chapter with, I have one thing I'm going to get across. There's one thing I'm going to tell you. And then he builds the scene around that one thing. Right? Because the story has to have meaning. Because it's not fiction. Right? If it's fiction, it doesn't have to have meaning. It's about the emotional experience of it. But this is teaching, right? Like you're teaching somebody something. So it's got to have some meaning. So what's in these 5 paragraphs? What's the one thing you would say, like, this is what I'm teaching?
Well, that it probably doesn't come across this way, but talking about finding a gym and settling down, finding restaurants. I mean, all the things that my eating disorder loves to grab a hold of.
Gotcha. So you're talking about like, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Ignoring the eating disorder causes a lot of anxiety. And
there you go. So this is what I need to see. I need to see you in the car having that anxiety and trying to ignore the eating disorder.
Right.
That's the scene we need, right? Like you've got it started here. You're in the car, you're ignoring the eating disorder. Then I need to see you looking for an apartment and trying to ignore the eating disorder.
Right.
And then I need to see, because the conflict you just presented to me, right? Like to go back to that language of conflict, choice, and consequences, I'm moving and I have this eating disorder nagging at me, like calling to me to make decisions based on its desires. And I'm trying to ignore it. So I need you in the car, getting more anxious in the like parking lot of a highway as you try to ignore the eating disorder. I need you at the apartment, like thinking like, well, maybe if I just get away from the parking lot and I can get to the beach, I'll be able to ignore the eating disorder. So I need you like looking at an apartment, refusing to think about where restaurants and gyms are. And then I need to see you moving in, like maybe even a little proud of yourself, but then immediately like leaving the house and being like, okay, now it's time to find a gym. And that's the consequence, right? Like the anxiety and the like then desperation to find a gym is the consequence of those things, right? Like, so you've got your teaching point. We just need to restructure this scene so that each moment of the scene is communicating that point.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? And that will zoom us in.
Yeah.
Right. So as you go through this, I would start looking at these scenes and being like, okay, with these paragraphs, what am I trying to say to somebody? What am I trying to do? Right? Like one of the chapters that really stood out to me in Greenlights with Matthew McConaughey is his conversation about how he got into acting. And the point that he's trying to make, at least that I interpreted as a reader, was when you have an opportunity, regardless of if you're prepared or if you're scared, you say yes, right? That's the whole theme of the book. Green lights. You see a green light, you hit the gas and you go. So he's got this chapter about he's in a bar and he's hanging out with these girls in Austin, Texas. It's like 2:00 in the morning. And this guy who also wants to hang out with the hot girls he's with is like, you know, hey, come drink with me. And they drink all night long. And then in the middle of drinking, the guy's like, hey, why don't you, I'm a movie producer. And in the morning, I'm shooting this movie. Why don't you come and just like be in the background? And Matthew McConaughey is like, hey, I'm not an actor. I've never like done theater, but green light. Right. So he shows up and then they're and it's really about his car, right? Like they really like his car. So they put the car in the shot and then he's just hanging around on the set. And then they have a moment where one of the actresses, the scene's kind of dead. And the director's like, hey, we need something else here to spice this up. And they look at him, they're like, hey, Matthew, go get in that scene. And so he just walks into the scene, right? And he's like, green light, right? Like, I don't have any lines prepared. I don't know what I'm going to say, but I'm just going to walk. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to go. And that's his like theme of like, if you're ready and you say yes, opportunities are going to present themselves and you can just like walk into them. And then he's using this story about how he got into acting to talk about that theme. So you have a theme here of trying to ignore my eating disorder causes anxiety. You can give us the like, you know, summary version of these events if they're structured around that theme, because we understand then why you're giving it to us.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real thing with Memoir, is that like replacing word for word dialogue and like nitty gritty in the dirt with the scenes. If we know why we're here with you in this moment, we feel like part of what's going on, because it's all about giving the reader ownership of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So if I feel like I'm on the journey with you, I'll feel more engaged in reading it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
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 So here you've got this teaching point. Jenny Schaefer called Life Without Ed, in which she described her eating disorder as something separate from herself. Whenever you're citing somebody here, quote them like you did down here, because you make us feel like we're in a conversation with that expert, right?
Right.
So, like Jenny Schaefer said in her book, Life Without Eating Disorder, comma, quote, and give me the quote.
Okay.
Right? Like, I have a kid next to me now.
That's all right. Good.
I'm on a phone call. You got to tell me later. Yeah. This is life in the basement.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. This is doing a second job with 5 children in the house.
5 kids. Wow.
Yeah, I got 5 kids. He's my youngest. He's super cute too. Much to our detriment. So with this moment, quoter, because it makes the quote makes us feel a connection to her.
Right.
Right now, we've got a secondary connection going on, which is you talking about what you read. Right? Share us what you read. Give us the quote. It's more work for you as a memoir writer because you got to go find the quote. But if you're summarizing her, that's fine. Like, you know, you can't really get away from that. Like, there are going to be times where you're like, you know, summarizing someone else's work. That's just how it goes. But if you can give us the quote, give us the quote. If I had a moment like this of teaching, when you're editing through your manuscript and you're kind of rebuilding around each theme, the first question I'd ask myself is, does this fit up here? Or is this its own scene?
Right.
This may be its own scene. It might be talking about eating disorder as something separate from yourself. I could see you having a chapter where you start off with this quote, and then you give us examples in the chapter of what that looks like. Right? Of like, hey, I'm having this conversation with my eating disorder because it's something different for myself. I've done some work in my day job with anxiety disorders. And one of my favorite academic, really brilliant professors that I've worked with always says she has an anxiety disorder. And she says she wakes up in the morning and looks at it and says like, hello, anxiety disorder. We're going to go to work today.
Yeah,
just
right.
To like let her like talking to her own anxiety disorder.
Sure.
So whatever that looks like for you, right? Like starting a chapter with this kind of quote, this academic, you know, more academic look at something, and then giving us examples of how that operates in your life, that takes this teaching moment and makes it super engaging.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
So then we have the bigger paragraph here where you're like summarizing your whole story. My bet is as you look through the book, you're going to find that you do this pretty routinely. Because we all do. When we're writing nonfiction, this is just something that we do. We tend to like go back and look at the whole story and summarize the whole thing. I could see each of these as a point. Now that we've talked about making a point, do you see what I mean about like how each of these could be their own scene?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I initially viewed my eating disorder as a safe haven that was there to protect me from the great unknowns haunting life. Oh, excellent. Right? Like that could be a scene. I expected drug, like this paragraph right here is so well written. It could be its own just really powerful moment.
Mm-hmm.
The seeds for the relationship were there from the beginning, where I unconsciously grew to depend on the sense of control that ED represented. It was a sanctuary of refuge that helped me define who I was, how I should live my life, and distract me from crippling anxiety. This is the onset of illness. The eating disorder was an island in the middle of a raging river where I found safety from the turbulent waters that threatened me. This could also, like, that is a beautiful ending to a fantastic scene where you show us what that looks like. And then this is a crushing concluding paragraph that's super strong.
Okay.
But the way it's structured right now, where you're just giving me paragraph after paragraph of summary information, I tune out. Because I'm here to be in the forest. I showed up to the memoir to see what your life was like. That's why I came.
To see and to feel, right?
Yeah, to feel your experience. So when I say see what your life is like, I mean, like, I want to live it. I want to be in it. I want to like have this moment, right? Like I read Matthew McConaughey's Green Lights because I want to know what it's like to be Matthew McConaughey. Right? Like I read The Year of Yes.
Oh, yes.
I'm so terrible with names. I read that book because I wanted to know what it was like to be her.
Right.
Right. To have a year where my career would just take off. Right. Like I'm reading Reborn in the USA because I want to know what it's like to see America from outside eyes.
Gotcha.
Right. So you gotta let me be you.
Okay.
Now, putting that aside now and looking at like this beautifully written 2 pages, because it is beautifully written. You get like 2 of these a book. Right?
Okay.
You get an intro, and then you can have one of these big like summary, hey, here is the massive point I'm trying to land every once in a while.
Okay.
But you can't do them every chapter.
I tried to make it interesting by putting it as a metaphor.
Oh, it's a beautiful metaphor. Like it is good. You're just fighting against our attention span.
Right. Right.
It's like I said, the writing's beautiful.
Thank you.
You're just fighting our attention span.
Right.
And so like that's not a battle you're going to win.
Yeah. I hear you.
We have phones and we have Netflix and we have Amazon Prime and there's a new Marvel movie out and there's everything is happening at once. Right. And if you're writing to men who have eating disorders, they want to go work out. Right. Like, so you got to catch their attention in the moment and live in the moment.
Okay.
And then after you've earned my attention by living in the moment, that's when you can drop a page and a half like this.
Okay.
But you got to earn my attention first. So when you drop these has to be very strategic. And again, it's beautifully written. It's a good one to drop, but you didn't earn my attention up here.
Okay.
I didn't live the moment up here. So by the time I got down to here, I was like, man, he's doing a lot of teaching. Right. But not in an academic way, not like an expert who's done research. Right. So like you got to earn that thing. Again, going back to like preaching class and sermons, great sermons are carried by a story, by a moment that you want everyone to live. Now, some of the greatest orators of all time, like, Martin Luther King Jr., who's my favorite, could stand up and speak in paragraphs like this and pull it off. But he wasn't speaking as like a memoir storyteller. He was speaking as a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very structured. And it's like, here are the three things, even though it's super poetic, there's intense structure in his sermons that are like, here are the things I want you to walk away with. And then he meditates on each one and he circles back to them. And there's a whole different style, right? Like that leans more into that like teaching academic type writing than the memoir type writing.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you're thinking memoir type order, you're thinking like Garrison Keillor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Talking about like Lake Wobegon, which I know is fictional, but that like memoir-esque like orator who's like going to tell you a story and convey meaning through the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you seem to be going for. So when you do that, these moments have to be very sparing,
Okay.
and they gotta hit with like this again, great moment. But if you don't want to use this as a big climactic, like here's what I'm trying, here's the lesson I'm trying to get across to you with these 3 chapters, then I would break, you've got great components here to have a chapter for each one.
Okay.
And my bet is, because I know how we all write this stuff, because I've done it myself, my bet is that you actually already have these stories in the book. You just got to pair them up.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
Right.
sense? Like my
Sure.
bet is you already have a story about viewing your eating disorder as a safe haven.
Right.
You just got to pair it with this paragraph, right?
Okay.
My bet is you already have a story about unconsciously growing to sense the control, right? Like that, like you were using it in one way and then it turned on you. My bet is you have a story about it turning on you. And you
Right.
just pair these paragraphs with that story. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Any questions or anything else you want to talk about with this section?
No, it's great.
Okay.
Really good advice.
So now let's drop into the scene with Beth. What is the goal of this scene?
um,
Is this it here, that you're trying to live by the principles that you should select with battles? Like what if the reader were to
yeah.
read this moment with Beth, what are you hoping they learn from this moment?
Well, I haven't done a good job of relating it yet to my eating disorder. I don't think. I think it does, and I'm trying to, and I think that it does by not because not being in control. I mean, losing control of a situation that just blindfolded me uh, or blinded me.
Yeah, blindsided you. Yeah.
Like walking into a room with, in fact, I cover this in the next chapter, I think, about landmines, stepping on landmines. And I never knew when I was going to step on a landmine.
Oh, that's it. So that you said that word, and I was like, oh, that's what he's talking about. So this is its own chapter, and it's your dialogue is great. I'm in the moment, right? Like I'm happy to help you, I said as I opened the kitchen drawer in a newly remodeled ranch style home in an upscale neighborhood in suburban Kansas. Ben, I'm there, right? Like I'm in, I'm with you, right? You've got Beth, you're going back and forth here with Beth is fantastic. Just drop in here when she first criticizes you about not using the right knife. You don't use a serrated knife to cut an eggplant, use a straight knife, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right here, I need a sentence about how that is emotionally impacting you.
Right.
And like, and then have her keep going, right? Like, you need her, we can talk about the dialogue here in a minute, but talking about it from a bigger structure, she's going to respond. And then you're going to say like, what's so bad about this? Right? Like, and then you look at her and she's getting tense. And then she says like, I think you're taking this stuff too seriously. Or you say, are you upset with me? And then she says like, she shakes her head in disbelief. And then you've got this line, I'm not happy that you refuse to learn how to do things the right way. Right. And then after she makes this utterance, talk to me about landmines,
Mm-hmm.
right? Give me a paragraph about landmines and what they do and what they make you think and what
I'm not
happens to
safe.
your eating
You know,
disorder.
it's like my safety is
Yeah.
in jeopardy.
Yeah. Yeah. Your safety's in jeopardy. How does that make your eating disorder work? Do you want to
Mm-hmm.
go work out now? Right? Like
Yeah.
what's happening in your brain when that happens? And then now, if you do that, now I'm living this moment with you.
Okay.
And I'm living this moment and coming to understand your eating disorder at the same time. Right? Like,
Right.
so with just by taking your next chapter and this scene and putting them together, you've got a great moment where you're
Okay.
teaching me something through a story. I'm in the trees, I'm in the middle of it, right? Like, and I'm feeling what you're feeling, and I'll understand it 1,000 times deeper.
Right.
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 Yeah. So that's everything I wanted to talk to you about like the larger view of the text.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your scene
Great.
in general and your use of dialogue. There's only one tip I have for you with dialogue,
Uh-huh.
because your dialogue's so good. There's one tip I have, which is dialogue is a call and response, especially when you have two people, when it's a two-person conversation, right? Person A says one thing, person B responds, person A responds, person B responds, person A responds, person B responds. You do that really well until you get down into here where we start losing who's responding. And what happens is you lose Beth's response. So, yep, looks pretty straight to me. I said, admiring my coloring skills. What isn't masterful about this? You don't use a serrated knife to cut an eggplant. You use a straight knife. I can't believe you use that knife. What's so bad about this? Showing off my eggplant strips down line in a dish of olive oil. Noticing her tense face, I looked into her squinting dark brown eyes. I think you may be taking this a little too seriously. Are you upset? So I have two responses from you here and no response from her.
Uh-huh.
Which
Right.
isn't bad because this is all one thought. But if it's all one thought, put it on the same line.
Right. Sure.
Because
Sure.
so then you can have Beth shook her head in disbelief. But you see how that, like, the missing of the call and response makes me question who's saying this.
Right.
Right. So
Absolutely.
if we can put that on that line, we can see that this is you, this is her. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then you know where to insert the like thought about the teaching moment about like, hey, here's what I want to do, to when you come to the end of a moment, right? Like, so here's the end of the moment. Beth shook her head in disbelief. She was the type of person who always followed the rules. If there was a proper way to make a bed, I'm going to skim a little bit, but using the wrong knife seemed like a stretch even for her. I was more oriented toward just getting the job done, particularly in mundane tasks of life. Now here I want a teaching moment about landmines.
Okay.
And then you can jump back into the scene. I'm not happy you refused, or she says, I'm not happy you refused to learn things the right way, but I need to know that this is her talking.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah.
make sense? Because
Sure.
we're coming back to it, right? Like Beth looked at me in the eye and said, I'm not happy. Like once you have the paragraph about landmines, I need to know it's her again so that I know, like, okay, I'm back into the call and response. I'm
Mm-hmm.
back into the give and take.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The
Absolutely.
emotional build here is great, by the way.
Oh,
You've
great.
written an argument. Arguments can be difficult to nail because there's a lot of like push and pull, but it's clear that she's pushing and you're trying to back away and she just keeps coming at you. It's
Mm-hmm.
really strong emotional engagement. I can feel it in the dialogue and how it's moving, which is really good.
Great.
And then this last paragraph here needs to be your summary paragraph about landmines. This
Okay.
is what they are. This is how they impacted me. This is what you can look out for, right? Because the best part of writing a memoir is not just giving us your experience and living in your world, but in this kind of memoir where you're actually teaching me about something, being like, hey, this is how it applies. This is how it might apply to you, right? Like, and dropping that in there in a concluding paragraph only sometimes. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
All right. That
Yeah.
was all I had, man. Anything else you want to talk about with the?
No, God, you did a great job of dissecting this and giving me some solid feedback. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, hey,
Yeah.
if you get another, and I mean this, if you get to a place where you've got a chapter written like we talked about, where you're in the middle of a scene and you're making points, send it to me. I'll happily read it for you.
Oh, God, that's great, Jeff.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely,
I,
man.
I really appreciate this. Yeah. Can I ask you, is it possible you could send me that audio just so I can?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'll send you this recording.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Before the show.
Yeah. I'm not sure when I'm going to post it, but I'll send it to you this afternoon.
Oh, that's great because
Yep.
I try to take a few notes and I'd like to listen to it again.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. I record every session for that reason. So that
Oh,
you
that's
have a copy of it.
awesome. That's great. No, you're very enlightening. You know what you're talking about, and thank you for the compliments. I appreciate
Yeah.
that.
I don't give them when they're not deserved.
I
So, all
don't think you do.
right. I'm going to pause the recording. We can talk a little bit more.